Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another chapter together. This time, Chapter 5, Information Privacy, really bringing to bear all the theory, the technology we're learning, and the ethics and morals and the law. Information privacy affects all of us. Because in the old days, privacy probably meant a different thing. On a ship, someone would be shoveling coal down a place called steerage. And the steerage area of the ship was once used to accommodate passengers traveling on the cheapest class of ticket. You might have seen that in the movie Titanic. And they were offered only the most basic amenities, typically with limited toilet use, etc. No privacy. That's what lack of privacy meant, and poor food. But today, as we started in Chapter 1, we've been asking the question, is technology changing us, or are we changing technology, right? Who's having the effect on who? And so the Google CEO kind of puts it this way in the book to open up this chapter, where they say, with your permission, you give us more information. If you give us information about who some of your friends are, we can probably use some of that information, again, with your permission, to improve the quality of our searches. We don't need you to type at all because we know where you are, with your permission. We know where you've been, with your permission. We can more or less guess what you're thinking about. And that was Eric Schmidt from Google. I think that really characterizes quite well what we've done. I've said before, I think the new generation of young people look at privacy much differently than older people. Older people want to protect it, it seems like. The younger generation seems to want to protect it, but they seem less concerned. They seem more interested in convenience, and they're willing to give it up. I just throw that out as a hypothetical, theoretical statement. I'm happy to receive comments back. I'm just toying with ideas in academia, but I think it's an important distinction of where we're going. So here's kind of the chapter overview and what we're going to talk about over the next hour or so. We have to ask, do you want to know where I live? Well, all you have to do is go to whitepages.com. Maybe you'd go to Zillow.com, right? Do you want to see outside of my house? Go to Google Maps, right? It's all there. What about my friends on Facebook? You can get even a bigger glimpse of my personal life, right? It all seems to be out there. So, Scott McNally, the former CEO of Sun Microsystems, said, "You have zero privacy anyway. Get over it." Now, I find that approach unpalatable, unacceptable, not worthy of intellect, right? Not just get over it. We have to talk about what is good for society. Oh, maybe this is relating to societal ethics, right? So, again, throwing that out there. Some of you may want to write to that angle. So there are perspectives on privacy to discuss, right? Philosophers struggle to define privacy, frankly. Discussions about privacy revolve around the notion of access, where access means physical proximity to, especially to knowledge, right? And so from the point of view of an individual seeking to restrict access, privacy is known as this zone of inaccessibility. This is mine, right? I want to restrict your access to it. However, right, there's always another side. Privacy is not the same thing as being alone, right? As we talked about in the first slide in that steerage example. Two people can have a private relationship. That's an interesting perspective, right? So it's not being alone, right? Stepping over this line and violating someone's privacy, though, it is considered almost always an affront to a person's dignity. If they're alone, if they are in a relationship, but step over the line. that would be an affront to someone else's dignity. And so seems a violation of privacy, right? So you violate someone's privacy when you treat him or her as a means to an end. That should sound familiar, right? And a lot of your comments should reference that if you prefer Kant's approach, Kantianism. So privacy can encourage social and economic inequalities, it's true. And the public at large, on the other hand, may benefit if the group has less privacy or sometimes more, right? So some people take advantage of privacy to plan and carry out illegal or immoral acts. We know this, right? We're going to talk later about hackers in pacemakers in someone's heart, right? It can get that bad. Often outsiders do not even acknowledge that a family member or a family is dysfunctional until one of the members gets seriously injured. That's a shame. That shouldn't happen. Where was the level of privacy that we owe them, and where do we break that for the safety of others? Those are questions we want to ask, because our culture respects privacy, right? Humans are social beings. Most of us seek some engagement with others, right? So we're not just being alone. So at what point do we step in or comment or violate someone's privacy, right? Because there can be harms. We know that. Again, there are benefits to it. Socialization and individualization are both necessary, right? We become social creatures, better social creatures, when we give up some of our privacy. But yet when we retain our privacy, we become the individual we are meant to be, right? We work through issues. We think things out, right? So privacy is necessary for a person to grow and bloom as an individual. It's a way in which social groups recognize and communicate to individuals that about their responsibility for their development as a unique person, right? A recognition of each person's true freedom is a benefit to privacy. And so in the privacy of our own home, right, we should be allowed to blow off steam. I think everybody would agree. And that privacy can foster intellectual activities like respect and love and friendship and trust are enhanced. You can think of privacy then as a sort of, the book would say, a moral capital, right? It's worth something, right? And people use this capital to build relationships, even intimate relationships, right? And without this moral capital, they have no means to develop these close personal relationships. Imagine everyone having a ladder of privacy, the book talks about. And at the top of the ladder is the person we share the most information with, right? And intimacy is not just about sharing information, but it's also about caring, about weighing the benefits and the harms, which really brings us back to the topic. So we conclude that granting people at least some privacy is better than denying them privacy at all. In one of the previous lectures, we talked about the young lady who took a picture of a gentleman with a joke t-shirt, right? And the conversation centered there, even around privacy. So is there a natural right to privacy, right? We would say a man's home is his castle, or now a person's home is their castle, right? And so we have to conclude that privacy, though, isn't a natural right, but it is considered a prudential right, okay? And so a little bit about that. Really, do people have a right to be left alone? Again, is privacy a natural right, like a right to life, perhaps? So our belief in a right to privacy may have grown, as we discussed earlier, out of the property rights discussion. And English common law, in fact, where we get most of our laws, though some of our laws are based on the Napoleonic concept, like in Louisiana, but most of our laws are based on the English common law tradition, right? Which would say that very thing: a man's home is his castle. And but then Parliament, back in the late 18th century, passed a quartering act, right? And part of it would allow the billeting of soldiers in private homes. This broke that centuries old common law tradition, right? And so what had previously been a strong link between a person and their property, right, would encourage someone to have a right to privacy, right? It's often argued that political, social, and economic changes demand recognition of new kinds of legal rights, right? Is this one of them? Would be what this course is about. So to make their cases, for example, you could focus on the abuse of newspapers, right? Some would argue that there are no adequate legal remedies to the victims that end up in a newspaper, right? And others have pointed out the right to privacy was also recognized by the French law. So the English common law, which is what most of American law is based on, the Napoleonic law also applied, especially in Louisiana and some of their territories. That French law would not say, like the English would say, a man's home is his castle. Well, the French would say their privacy approach would be the right to be alone, right? And so this respects, this definition, privacy, but it may be just a bit too narrow in that approach, right? Or too narrow, too broad. It's just not hitting the mark is what is assumed, right? And so every violation of privacy right is also a violation of some other right. That might be a better way of looking at privacy. And so if this is the case, there is really no need to define privacy precisely. If we consider that aspect, that a violation of privacy is also a violation of some other rights or cluster of rights, right? That's an interesting perspective. Then we don't have to formally define what privacy is. Not the English model, not the French model. We can just leave it as it's violating one of these other rights, right? And so people become these sort of autonomous moral agents. And so most commentators would agree that privacy is a prudential right. And that means rational agents would agree to recognize some privacy rights because granting those rights is to the benefit of all of society. I think we brought that back around pretty well. Now, privacy and trust. It is clear upon reflection that in some important ways we have more privacy than our ancestors did. For example, there was a strong pressure to conform periodic in the past, and there was a greater emphasis on community. Now modern culture fosters this sort of much greater privacy approach. And the consequences of all this privacy is that we live among strangers. I think we could all agree to that. And yet, when we live in a society with others, we must be able to trust them to some extent. In order to trust others, we have to rely on their reputations. And today's society gets a lot of information out of people to establish their reputations or even violate them. Such as a lie detector or a drug test, and they can go public. What about your credentials, your driver's license, maybe a key, an employee badge, a college degree, etc.? Privacy and trust. I've always said, and I really borrowed this from some academia literature I've read, that trust is in a formula, it's a skill or ability, benevolence, your willingness to do good for others, benevolence, or for the company, and integrity, right? And somewhere in there lies this prudential approach to privacy. Okay, let's stop there. We'll come back in a minute.